My in-laws said I'd never be good enough for their son. Now they're begging me to save their business. The first time I met Richard's parents was at the Westbrook Country Club, where the maitre d' greeted them by name and led us to the Montgomery table, apparently a permanently reserved spot with a view of both the golf course and the sunset. Perfect for Margaret Montgomery to hold court while her husband Charles nodded along, occasionally interjecting with statements that everyone treated like profound wisdom. I wore my best dress, the one splurge I'd allowed myself after landing my first proper job, and had practiced how to use each fork in the elaborate table setting by watching YouTube tutorials the night before. Richard had assured me his parents were down-to-earth despite the money, which I realized was the kind of thing only someone who had never worried about money would say. "So, Eliza," Margaret said, her voice dripping with the practiced warmth of someone who had chaired a dozen charity boards, "Richard tells us you work with computers?" I smiled, grateful for the softball question. "Yes, I'm a software developer, currently working for a very entry-level position," Richard jumped in, squeezing my hand under the table. He meant well, trying to manage his mother's expectations. But Eliza's brilliant. She's always coding these little side projects, too. Charles raised an eyebrow over his whiskey. Side projects? Like what? Building websites for your friends' wedding invitations. I felt my cheeks flush. Actually, I'm developing an integrated platform that helps businesses track their logistics and supply chain in real time. It automates. How lovely, Margaret interrupted, signaling the waiter for more wine. A little hobby to keep you busy. Richard mentioned you didn't finish your master's degree. And there it was. The first dig of what would become a relentless excavation of my inadequacies over the coming years. I left the program to start working, I explained. I was learning more hands-on than in the classroom. Charles chuckled. Education is never just about the learning, my dear. It's about the connections. The pedigree. Something the Montgomery name has understood for generations. 3 generations, Margaret corrected. Since Charles's grandfather founded Montgomery Manufacturing in 1937, Richard represents our 4th. I nodded, knowing this history by heart from Richard's stories. The family business produced specialized machine parts, initially for military equipment, then diversifying into commercial manufacturing. They were old money, old methods, old thinking. And what does your father do again? Margaret asked, though Richard had surely told her multiple times. He was a high school science teacher. He passed away when I was in college. And your mother? She's a nurse. In Arizona now. The conversation moved on quickly. Too painful to dwell on the ordinary, I suppose. Throughout dinner, they spoke about people I didn't know, clubs I'd never be invited to join, and traditions I couldn't possibly understand as an outsider. When dessert arrived, Charles steered the conversation to Richard's role in the family business. The quarterly numbers are concerning, he said. We're losing market share to those offshore operations. It's time we brought Richard more formally into the strategic planning. Richard sat up straighter. I've been saying we need to digitize more of our operations, modernize our. What we need, Charles cut in, is to remind our clients why American-made quality from a family business matters. Relationships, not gadgets. I couldn't help myself. Actually, the most successful manufacturing businesses are integrating digital. Margaret's laugh was like cut crystal, sharp and transparent. Oh, Eliza dear, business is about handshakes and history, not apps and algorithms. The drive home was quiet until Richard apologized. They're from a different era, he said. They'll warm up to you. They didn't. After we married, a lavish affair that felt more like a Montgomery business function than a celebration of our love, I moved into Richard's downtown apartment. By day, I worked my developer job. By night, I built my platform line by meticulous line of code. Family dinners became a monthly exercise in restraint. Each time, I arrived hopeful, and each time, I left deflated. Still doing your computer games? Charles would ask, not waiting for an answer before turning to his son. Richard, we need to discuss the Hammerstein account. They're threatening to move to Precision Tech if we don't match their efficiency. Maybe Eliza could look at our systems, Richard suggested once. She's working on something similar to what We don't need outside consultants, Margaret said, patting her son's hand. Especially not hobbyists. The way she said it made it clear I was the hobbyist, the amateur, the girl playing at business while the adults handled the real work. During the third Christmas at the Montgomery estate, I overheard Margaret in the kitchen. I just expected someone more suitable, she whispered to Charles. Harvard Business dropped out to chase her. She could have given us grandchildren already instead of staring at a screen all night. What does Richard see in her? She'll get bored eventually, Charles replied. These creative types always do. Then she'll settle into being a proper Montgomery wife. I slipped away, heart pounding. That night, while Richard slept, I worked until dawn, fueled by something stronger than caffeine. The determination to prove them wrong. Months passed. At another insufferable dinner, the conversation turned to Montgomery Manufacturing's latest client loss. They wanted faster turnaround times, Charles complained, as if quality craftsmanship can be rushed. It's not about rushing, I ventured. Modern tracking systems can identify bottlenecks in the production line and… Eliza, Margaret sighed, this isn't like ordering shoes online. These are precision components for industries that matter. I understand that. My platform actually addresses. Richard's hand squeezed my knee, our signal for me to stop. I swallowed the rest of my explanation along with my pride. Later that night, Richard found me at my computer, eyes burning from hours of coding. What are you working on so intensely? He asked, genuinely curious for the first time. I hesitated, then turned the screen toward him. Remember that hobby your parents keep dismissing? This is it. He squinted at the complex interface. This looks professional. It is. I straightened my shoulders. I've been building it for almost 2 years now. It's almost ready to launch. Launch? Like, as a business? Yes, Richard. As a business. I looked him directly in the eyes. A real one. His expression shifted from confusion to something I hadn't seen before when he looked at me, respect tinged with surprise. Why didn't you tell me it was this serious? I closed my laptop. Would you have believed it was? Or would you have seen it the way your parents do, as their unambitious daughter-in-law playing entrepreneur? He didn't answer, which was answer enough. The next day, I registered Nexus Logistics Systems LLC using my maiden name. I didn't tell Richard. I didn't tell anyone. While my in-laws continued to judge me as not good enough for their precious family legacy, I was quietly building my own. And every time Margaret called my work silly app stuff, or Charles talked over me at dinner, I smiled politely and said nothing. Because sometimes, silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the sound of someone building something revolutionary. The Montgomery family's annual charity gala was a spectacle of wealth, crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, and enough designer outfits to fill a fashion magazine. While Margaret floated through the ballroom collecting praise for her philanthropy, I slipped away to the garden terrace, laptop hidden in my clutch. 3 minutes until the Japan call, I whispered to myself, checking my watch. I'd become an expert at living 2 lives. By day, I was Eliza Montgomery, disappointing daughter-in-law. By night, I was E.J. Chun, founder and CEO of Nexus Logistics, a name gaining traction in tech circles for its revolutionary approach to supply chain management. There you are, Richard appeared, loosening his bow tie. Mother's looking for you. Something about meeting the Vanderbilts. I'll be right there, I promised. Just need some air. He nodded, kissing my forehead before returning inside. The moment he disappeared, I opened my laptop and connected to the garden's Wi-Fi. Sorry for the unusual setting, I told the Tokyo investors on my screen. I'm at a family function. They didn't mind. After seeing the demo of my platform's AI integration, they were too impressed to care if I was calling from a closet. While the Montgomerys were posting legacy family photos on social media, I was securing my first $1 million in seed funding. The real breakthrough came when I connected with Maya Patel, a brilliant former Google engineer looking for her next challenge. Over coffee at a small cafe far from Montgomery's social circles, I pitched her my vision. So this whole time, Your in-laws think you're playing computer games, but you're actually building enterprise software that could revolutionize their industry? Maya laughed, reviewing my code. That's either the best revenge plot I've ever heard or the worst family communication I can imagine. Maybe both, I admitted. Are you in? 2 days later, Maya became my CTO, working remotely from her apartment across town. We operated in stealth mode, using my maiden name on all company documents. Richard knew I was working on my project, but the extent of it remained vague to him. I told myself it wasn't deception, just self-preservation. 6 months later, we landed our first major client, Precision Tech, Montgomery Manufacturing's biggest competitor. What's got you smiling at your phone? Richard asked over breakfast as I read the signed contract email. Just a breakthrough on my app, I said. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. That's great, honey, he replied, already distracted by his own work emails. By the way, Dad's birthday dinner is tonight. Mom wants us there by 7. At dinner, Charles complained about Precision Tech's sudden efficiency improvements. They've implemented some new system, he grumbled, cutting delivery times by 30%. Our clients are asking why we can't do the same. Maybe it's time to consider digital solutions, Richard suggested carefully. Margaret sighed dramatically. Not this again. Montgomery Manufacturing has thrived for generations without these Silicon Valley fads. Actually, I ventured. Logistics technology isn't a fad. It's transforming manufacturing worldwide. Charles waved dismissively. Eliza, dear, stick to what you know. How are those little app games of yours coming along? I took a sip of wine to hide my smile. Moving forward, slowly but surely. That night, I closed a deal with a global tech giant while sitting in our guest bathroom during a Montgomery family movie night. As Nexus grew, so did my need for excuses. Late-night coding sessions became insomnia. Investor meetings became coffee with friends. My growing bank account remained separate from our shared finances, a decision Richard found odd but accepted as my independent streak. The contrast between my worlds became increasingly surreal. One afternoon, I stepped out of a virtual meeting where I'd been addressed as Miss Chen, the visionary behind Nexus, to join the Montgomerys for lunch, where Margaret immediately asked me to pass the salt while talking over my greeting. By our 3rd year of operation, Nexus had secured clients across 3 continents. The irony wasn't lost on me that our software could have saved Montgomery Manufacturing millions in operational costs, the exact problems Charles complained about at every family gathering. Their systems are dinosaurs, Maya told me during a strategy meeting in my home office. From what you've described, they're hemorrhaging money through inefficiency. I've tried to suggest changes, I said, remembering countless dismissed conversations. They're not interested in advice from someone they see as a hobbyist. Maya squeezed my shoulder. Well, this hobbyist just closed an 8-figure valuation round. Maybe one day they'll wish they'd listened. Maybe, I replied, not knowing how prophetic those words would prove. When Richard asked about my increasingly frequent work trips, I deflected with vague explanations about consulting opportunities. He seemed proud, if confused by my sudden professional advancement. I promised myself I'd tell him everything soon, once Nexus was too established to be dismissed as lucky or trivial. What I didn't know then was that soon would arrive faster and more dramatically than I could have imagined. The Montgomery Sunday brunch was a tradition as rigid as their business practices. Every month, we gathered at their sprawling colonial home, where conversation never strayed from family legacy, social connections, and subtle reminders of my outsider status. This particular Sunday, I arrived late after finalizing Nexus's expansion into European markets. As I slipped into the sunroom where brunch was served, something felt different. The usual hum of self-congratulatory conversation was replaced by tense silence. Charles and Richard were huddled near the window, speaking in hushed tones. 30% drop in the last quarter alone. I caught Charles saying, his usual commanding voice now brittle with worry. What about the Westridge contract? Richard asked.
Gone.
To Precision Tech, along with Damasco and Klein Industries. I busied myself with coffee, pretending not to hear while Margaret tried to salvage the atmosphere by loudly discussing her latest charity board appointment. "Eliza, darling, you're positively glowing," she exclaimed with practiced cheerfulness. "Must be all that fresh air from your morning walks." My morning walks were actually strategy calls with international clients, but I smiled and nodded. "Richard tells me you've been traveling for work. How interesting. I didn't realize entry-level programming positions required travel." "I've taken on some consulting projects," I replied vaguely, watching Richard and Charles from the corner of my eye. Richard's shoulders were slumped, his face drawn with stress I hadn't noticed at home. Charles rejoined the table, attempting nonchalance. "So, what's new with everyone?" Throughout brunch, I caught fragments of their concern: canceled orders, clients jumping ship, operational bottlenecks. The mighty Montgomery Manufacturing was hemorrhaging business, exactly as Maya had predicted. On the drive home, Richard was uncharacteristically quiet. "Want to talk about it?" I finally asked. He sighed deeply. "Dad didn't want me to worry you, but things at the company are challenging." "What kind of challenging?" "The kind where we've lost 3 major clients in 2 months. The kind where our production costs are 40% higher than our competitors. The kind where my father still refuses to consider that maybe, just maybe, his way of doing business belongs in the last century." My stomach twisted with conflicting emotions: sympathy for my husband's distress, vindication that the changes I'd suggested were exactly what they needed, and guilt over my role in their competitors' success. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "It's not your fault," he replied with bitter irony. "Though it's funny, that logistics platform you've been working on sounds exactly like what we need right now." Dad would never admit it, though. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Maybe if you presented the idea as your own?" Richard laughed hollowly. "I've tried. He says digital transformation is too expensive, too risky. Meanwhile, we're bleeding clients to companies that have already made the leap." That night, I lay awake beside Richard, my mind racing. My company was thriving, so much so that I'd recently moved our headquarters to an actual office space instead of various coffee shops and my home office. Meanwhile, my husband's family legacy was crumbling. The next morning, I made a decision. I would finally show Richard what I'd built. Not just a hobby, but a multi-million-dollar company that could save his family's business. Before I could work up the courage, though, my phone rang. "Miss Chun." It was Maya. Precision Tech wants to increase their subscription tier. They're seeing a 45% improvement in production efficiency. My heart sank. Precision Tech's gain was directly Montgomery Manufacturing's loss. "That's great," I managed. "Also, you'll never believe who reached out about a demo. Clearstream Manufacturing, they're one of the biggest in the industry, right?" Clearstream wasn't just one of the biggest. They were Montgomery Manufacturing's oldest client. The cornerstone relationship Charles boasted about at every opportunity. "They're shopping around," I realized aloud. Over the next few weeks, I watched from the sidelines as the Montgomery empire began to visibly fracture. Richard came home later each night, exhaustion etched on his face. At family gatherings, Margaret's social media posts became increasingly desperate displays of prosperity: gala attendance, charity donations, vacation home renovations, even as Charles's business updates grew sparse. The most telling moment came at a dinner where Charles, 3 scotches in, finally acknowledged reality. "We may need to consider alternatives," he admitted grudgingly. "Perhaps some modernization." "I've been saying that for years," Richard replied, frustration evident. "Yes, well, times change," Charles conceded without actually admitting he'd been wrong. "I've arranged a meeting with a venture capital group, Emergent Technologies. They specialize in revitalizing traditional industries." I nearly choked on my wine. Emergent Technologies was the investment arm I'd helped establish with profits from Nexus, using my E.J. Chun identity. They had no idea they were about to pitch to their own daughter-in-law. "When's the meeting?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice casual. "Next Thursday," Charles replied. "Not that we need outside money, of course. Just strategic partnerships." Richard gave me a knowing look. His father's pride was still intact, even if their business wasn't. "I'd like to come along," I said suddenly. For support. Charles and Margaret exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of me witnessing their vulnerability. I'm not sure that's necessary, Margaret began. Actually, Richard interrupted, I'd appreciate having Eliza there. She understands tech better than any of us. Charles hesitated before nodding reluctantly.
Fine.
But this is a delicate negotiation. Just observe. Little did they know, I'd be doing much more than observing. The night before the Emergent Technologies meeting, I sat Richard down in our living room. For years of secrecy weighed on me, and I could no longer justify keeping him in the dark. There's something you need to know before tomorrow. I began, my heart racing.
About me.
About my work. Richard looked up from his laptop, curiosity mixing with exhaustion on his face. I haven't been completely honest about what I've been building. I opened my computer and navigated to the Nexus Logistics website where my photo, under the name E.J. Chin, appeared alongside our company story. I don't understand, Richard said, leaning closer. This is you. Nexus isn't just an app I've been tinkering with. It's a full-scale logistics management platform. We have 42 employees, operations in 3 countries, and I took a deep breath. Your father's competitors are our biggest clients. The silence that followed felt eternal. Richard stared at the screen, then at me, his expression unreadable. Why didn't you tell me? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. At first, because I didn't think you'd believe in it. Then, because I didn't want you caught between me and your parents. And finally, I hesitated because I was afraid you'd see it as a betrayal. A betrayal? He looked confused. Richard, Nexus is what's helping Precision Tech and others outperform Montgomery Manufacturing. The efficiencies they've gained are directly because of my software. His eyes widened in realization. You're the reason we're losing clients. Not intentionally, I said quickly. I built something that works. It's not my fault your father refused to consider the same technology when I tried to explain it. Richard paced our living room, running his hands through his hair. This is a lot to process. There's more, I continued, deciding to rip off the entire bandage at once. Emergent Technologies, the VC firm you're meeting tomorrow? I'm one of the founding partners. He stopped pacing and stared at me. What? I reinvested my profits from Nexus. We specifically look for traditional industries needing technological overhauls. Your father's company is exactly our target investment. Richard sat heavily on the couch. So tomorrow, your father and mother are going to walk into that conference room and find me sitting at the head of the table. Richard was silent for so long I thought he might be angry. Then, to my surprise, he began to laugh, softly at first, then escalating until tears came to his eyes. The look on their faces is going to be. He shook his head, still laughing. God, Eliza. All these years they've been dismissing you, and you've been building an empire. Relief flooded through me. You're not upset? That my wife is a secret tech mogul? That the silly app stuff my parents mocked might save their company? He took my hands in his. I'm in awe, Eliza. And maybe a little ashamed I didn't see it sooner. I should have told you, I admitted. Yes, you should have. But I understand why you didn't. He pulled me into an embrace. So, what happens tomorrow? That depends, I said. Are we partners in this? His answer was a kiss that told me everything I needed to know. The Emergent Technologies offices occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise. All glass, chrome, and stunning views. I arrived 2 hours early, briefed the receptionist about the unique situation, and prepared the conference room. Richard arrived separately from his parents, giving me a subtle wink as he settled into a chair midway down the table. My assistant showed Charles and Margaret in exactly at 10 a.m. Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, she announced formally. The managing partner will be with you shortly. Margaret was already examining the room with a critical eye, no doubt comparing it to the old money boardrooms she was accustomed to. Charles arranged his presentation materials with military precision. Modern nonsense, he muttered, gesturing to the minimalist decor. Give me mahogany and tradition any day. The tradition that's bankrupting you? Richard asked quietly. Before Charles could respond, I entered through the side door, dressed in a power suit that cost more than all the clothes I'd owned when I first met the Montgomerys. "Good morning," I said calmly, enjoying the moment their eyes registered my presence. "Thank you for coming to Emergent Technologies." Margaret's mouth fell open. Charles froze mid-movement, presentation folder suspended in air. "Eliza," Margaret managed. "What is the meaning of this? Where is the managing partner?" "You're looking at her," I replied, taking my seat at the head of the table. Though in professional circles, I go by E.J. Chin, my maiden name. Charles's face flushed dark red. "This is absurd. Some kind of joke." "I assure you, Mr. Montgomery, Emergent Technologies is no joke. We manage a portfolio worth over $300 million. I slid financial reports across the table. "But you're not here to invest in us. You're here because you need us to invest in you." The silence was thick enough to cut. Richard cleared his throat. "I think you should hear what Eliza has to say, Dad." Charles looked betrayed. "You knew about this?" "None till last night," Richard replied honestly. "But I'm glad I know now." I opened a sleek laptop and projected Nexus Logistics' platform onto the wall screen. "Let me show you what your competitors have been using to outperform Montgomery Manufacturing for the past 3 years." As I walked them through the software, the automated tracking, the AI-driven efficiency optimizations, the predictive maintenance protocols, I watched the transformation on Charles's face. Disbelief gave way to understanding, then to the dawning horror of recognition. "This is what you were trying to tell us about," he said quietly. "All those dinners, all those suggestions we dismissed." "Yes," I said simply. Margaret looked between her husband and me, reality finally sinking in. "So, all this time, while we thought you were playing with hobby projects, I was building the very solution that could have saved you from your current predicament," I finished for her. Ironic, isn't it? The conference room felt smaller as the revelation hung in the air. Charles's face had lost its commanding certainty, while Margaret's perfect posture had wilted slightly. For once, they were speechless. I let the silence stretch, savoring this moment I'd imagined countless times over plates of expensive food where my opinions were treated as garnish, decorative but ultimately disposable. "Perhaps we should continue this another time," Charles finally said, gathering his papers with trembling hands. "Clearly there's been a misunderstanding about." "The only misunderstanding," I interrupted calmly, "was your belief that my ideas weren't worth listening to." I took a sip of water, letting the words sink in. "But we're here now, and Montgomery Manufacturing needs capital and modernization. Shall we proceed with your pitch?" Charles looked to Richard, who simply nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, Dad. Show Eliza what you've prepared." The presentation was painful to watch. Charles stumbled through projections based on outdated market analyses. He used tech buzzwords incorrectly, speaking of cloud capabilities and digital synergies, with the uncertain rhythm of someone reciting a foreign language phonetically. Margaret occasionally interjected with anecdotes about the company's history and tradition, as if heritage could compensate for hemorrhaging profits. When they finished, I closed my portfolio slowly. "Your company has lost 43% of its market share in the past 18 months, I stated. "Your production costs are nearly double the industry standard. 3 of your 5 largest clients have already left, and according to my sources, the other 2 are in talks with competitors." Charles's jaw tightened. "Your sources?" "I own the software that powers your competition, Mr. Montgomery. Their success metrics are quite literally on my dashboard." "This feels like a conflict of interest," Margaret objected, finding her voice. "You've been helping our competitors while pretending to be part of our family." "I've been part of your family for 6 years," I corrected, "during which time you've made it abundantly clear that I wasn't good enough to be a Montgomery." "We never said," Margaret began.
You didn't have to say it.
"You showed it. Every time you talked over me. Every time you dismissed my expertise as a little hobby. Every time you questioned why Richard would choose someone without the right pedigree." Richard reached over and squeezed my hand. "She's right, Mother. You and Dad never gave Eliza a chance." Charles cleared his throat. That's hardly relevant to the business discussion at hand. On the contrary, I replied, it's entirely relevant, because now you need something from me. You need my technology. You need my investment. You need the very skills and knowledge you've been belittling for years. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. When I turned back, I allowed myself a small smile. Tell me again why you think I'm not good enough to be in business? The words hung in the air between us. Charles's face flushed, and Margaret looked down at her manicured hands. That's not fair, Eliza, Charles began. Isn't it? I raised an eyebrow. Let me quote you, Charles. From last Thanksgiving. Business is about legacy and relationships, not computer games. Or you, Margaret, at the Christmas gala. Eliza's still playing with her little app while the adults handle real work. They exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognition dawning in their eyes. We may have underestimated your capabilities, Charles admitted reluctantly. Underestimated? I laughed softly. You ignored them completely. And now here we are. I tapped my tablet, bringing up a comparison chart on the screen, Montgomery Manufacturing's declining metrics alongside the dramatic improvements of their competitors after implementing Nexus logistics systems. This is what happens when tradition meets innovation, I explained. Your competitors embrace change. You resisted it. The results speak for themselves. So you're here to gloat? Charles asked, an edge of bitterness in his voice. No, I replied. I'm here to offer you a choice. Richard watched me with quiet pride as I laid out two scenarios. Option 1, Emergent Technologies walks away. You continue your decline until you're forced to sell off assets or close entirely. Your legacy ends with you. Charles paled visibly. Margaret reached for his hand. Option 2, she asked quietly. We invest. We implement Nexus systems throughout your operations. We modernize every aspect of Montgomery Manufacturing, from supply chain to client management. And in return? Charles asked, his voice hoarse. In return, we become majority stakeholders. Your company becomes a subsidiary of mine. The word mine landed like a physical blow. Charles flinched. That's outrageous, he sputtered. The Montgomery name has stood on its own for generations. And it can continue to stand, I assured him. Just not alone, and not in charge. Richard spoke up. Dad, this is the best option. I've seen Eliza's operation. It's exactly what we need. Charles looked at his son with something between betrayal and desperation. You're siding with her? Against your own family? This isn't about sides, Richard replied firmly. It's about survival. And Eliza is family too, whether you've treated her that way or not. I remained silent, allowing father and son to lock eyes in a wordless battle of wills. Finally, Margaret broke the tension. Charles, she said softly, we need to consider what's best for the company, for our future. A tear slipped down her perfectly made-up face, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in 6 years. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of vindication and empathy. The mighty Montgomerys were humbled, facing the consequences of their arrogance. Yet they were also my husband's parents, suddenly vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. I need some air, Charles announced abruptly, pushing away from the table. This is too much to process at once. Take all the time you need, I replied. But understand that this offer has an expiration date, just like your company's viability. As Charles and Margaret excused themselves to discuss privately, Richard turned to me with a complex expression. Was this your plan all along? He asked quietly. No, I answered honestly. My plan was to build something worthwhile. The rest just evolved. He nodded slowly. They're going to say yes, you know. They don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Richard, I replied. They're just not used to having the weaker position. 3 days after a meeting, Charles called to accept my terms. His voice was strained but formal, like a diplomat conceding territory after a long siege. Margaret didn't join the call. We'll need our lawyers to review the paperwork, he added, a final attempt at controlling the uncontrollable. Of course, I replied. My team will draw up the acquisition documents. The word acquisition made him inhale sharply, but he didn't object. The negotiations proceeded swiftly. Montgomery Manufacturing would become a subsidiary of Nexus Holdings. I would own 70% of the restructured company, with the Montgomery family retaining 30%. All major decisions would require my approval, though I allowed Charles to keep his title as company president, a gesture of mercy that Richard had encouraged. It's still his life's work, Richard had reminded me. Let him save some dignity. The day we signed the final paperwork, I arrived at the Montgomery estate rather than their corporate headquarters. My choice, a symbolic shift. We gathered in Charles's wood-paneled study, the same room where he'd once explained to me why women like me rarely understood the complexities of real business. I've reviewed everything, Charles said stiffly as lawyers from both sides observed. It seems in order. I signed with the fountain pen Richard had given me on our first anniversary, another symbol, this one private between us. As the lawyers collected the documents, an uncomfortable silence descended. Finally, Margaret spoke from where she'd been perched on a leather chair. "Will you dismiss us?" she asked bluntly. "Once it's all official?" The question surprised me. "Dismiss you?" "From the company," she clarified. "Charles has been preparing himself for it." I looked at Charles, who couldn't meet my eyes. For the first time, I saw fear in the man who had intimidated me for years. "That was never my intention," I said carefully. "Montgomery Manufacturing needs restructuring, not demolition. Charles's industry experience is valuable when paired with modern methods." Something in Charles's rigid posture relaxed slightly. That said, I continued, the company culture will change. Dramatically. No more decisions based on how we've always done things. No more dismissing ideas from people who don't fit your mold of what an executive should look like. Charles nodded slowly. "I understand. Do you?" I pressed. Because understanding requires acknowledging why your company failed in the first place. It wasn't just outdated technology. It was outdated thinking. Margaret bristled. "We built that company from..." "Your father-in-law built it," I corrected her. "You inherited it, and nearly destroyed it through arrogance and resistance to change." Richard put a hand on my shoulder, not to restrain me, but in solidarity. "We have a chance to rebuild something extraordinary," I continued more gently. "But only if you're willing to learn, to listen, even to people you once thought weren't good enough." The papers were signed, the lawyers departed, and the four of us remained in that study, a family transformed. Not healed, not yet, but irreversibly changed. The transformation of Montgomery Manufacturing became a case study in business schools within a year. With Nexus technology integrated throughout their operations, production costs dropped by 52%. Order fulfillment time decreased from weeks to days. Former clients returned, and new ones signed on. Charles struggled initially, bristling whenever I overruled his decisions. But gradually, as the results became undeniable, his resistance softened. I caught him once, explaining my logistics optimization algorithm to a client with genuine enthusiasm, a surreal moment that marked a turning point. Margaret's adjustment was different. She vacillated between cold formality and awkward attempts at connection. At one family dinner, she hesitantly asked about my childhood, the first time in 7 years she'd shown interest in my life before Richard. "I grew up watching my father teach," I told her. He could explain complex physics to teenagers who thought they'd never understand science. He taught me that intelligence takes many forms, and that dismissing someone's potential is the greatest arrogance. She nodded thoughtfully. "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was, I agreed. He would have enjoyed seeing his hobby coding daughter run a corporation. The holidays transformed as well. At Thanksgiving dinner, now held at our home rather than the Montgomery estate, I sat at the head of the table. Charles offered a toast to new traditions and second chances. Richard squeezed my hand under the table. In the boardroom, the power shift was absolute. My approval was required for all strategic decisions. My technology drove their resurgence. My vision shaped their future. Yet the most profound change wasn't in corporate structure or profit margins. It was in the way they looked at me, not just as their daughter-in-law, but as the architect of their salvation. One evening, after a particularly successful quarterly review, Charles lingered after the other executives left. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "For underestimating you. For all of it." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You do. I didn't see your potential because I wasn't looking for it. Not in someone like you. And now," he smiled ruefully, "now I see that the future of the Montgomery legacy isn't about preserving the past. It's about embracing change." He extended his hand. "Thank you for saving what matters." I accepted his handshake, feeling the weight of pride, vindication, and unexpected compassion. "You're welcome," I replied. "That's what family does." As I walked out of the boardroom, my heels clicking authoritatively on the marble floor that now bore both the Montgomery and Nexus logos, I couldn't help but smile at the journey. From dismissed outsider to undeniable force. From tolerated wife to respected leader. I was more than good enough. I was necessary,